Hello and welcome to another episode of Casting Views, the podcast that takes a topic each week and, as the name suggests, cast views. This week I'm on my own. I don't have a guest with me, so it's another opportunity to dive back into a subject I've been looking to go into a little bit more detail. I did an episode on this very early on with a lot of examples of the subject, but for this episode I'm still going to give you some examples, some personal and some I've found. But I wanted to dig a little bit more behind what a coincidence and what amazing coincidences are. Now, we all have those moments in our day where we'll be reading a book or saying a word and that word will appear somewhere else at the same time. Or we'll be humming a song and all of a sudden that song will come up on the radio. So, yeah, I think this is something that happens to all of us. So I was just trying to dig around a little bit more behind not necessarily science, but the psychology of that. But before we do get stuck into this, let's hear from a good friend of mine, good friend of the show, and also my co-host of the Pilot View sub-series, Justin Henson, over at the Movie Wire.
In a world with so many movies to choose from, one man has created the go-to podcast for reviews of hot and trending movies, so you know what's worth your time. The Movie Wire Podcast with host Justin Henson. Hear Justin's movie verdict wherever you listen to podcasts. Tune in to The Movie Wire today.
And I'm back. So yeah, as I said before that little promo, I'm going to put some personal stories in here as well. And I want to kickstart it off with one. And this is one that has probably really reinforced to me how wonderfully small the world can be. This story goes back, it's probably about 12, 13 years ago now. Probably more, actually, slightly more. But I've mentioned on the podcast before, my parents are Italian. My dad died just over 10 years ago now, but a couple of years before that, he was invited. So an uncle of mine was involved in this Italian organisation over here, and he had some people coming over from Italy to visit, and my aunt, my dad's sister, invited my dad and my mum over to their house for dinner just to have a bit more company with them. You know, my dad was always willing to talk and be friendly and find things out. So he was chatting to this guy. They were talking about, where they grew up. So my dad grew up in the Naples area and this guy grew up in Rome. But as they were starting to talk, they found out that their families at one point were both in the Naples area. And to cut a long story short, they started talking. They realised they knew the same people. They were talking about the same areas of the town and some of the shops, etc. So my dad asked his sister, my aunt, to go get a photo album. And they realised that they knew the same people. And the reason they knew the same people is that this guy and my dad and my aunt were cousins. Now, what had happened was the family had kind of split, and what I mean by that, they moved to different parts. So we've got to remember this. We're talking about like the 50s, 60s, right? This guy's family moved, my dad's cousin's family moved down to Rome. My dad's family stayed in Naples, and then my dad himself actually came to England in his late teens on his own to kind of set up his life here. And of course, they just drifted apart, as probably people do, especially all those years ago. They didn't keep in touch, the two families, and hence they didn't really know each other. Now, this really got me thinking. I mean, I just was blown away when I remember at the time when my dad came home that night and told us. And one of the things I'm thinking about is there are so many coincidences or so many factors that led up to that coincidence, right? Because you had firstly this guy out of everyone potentially that was coming over from like the Italian side of this organisation, it was him. Then there's the fact that he was coming to see my uncle. Then there's the fact that my aunt decided to invite my dad to that dinner. And then, of course, it was the frame of conversation they were having to then lead to the point to find out that they were related. So, that alone has just always stayed with me and will always blow my mind in terms of fate and the factors that can lead to two people who are connected, leading random lives to come together. So when I was thinking of revisiting this, as I mentioned at the start, I was kind of trying to look behind it. And I found a couple of articles on some professors and psychologists. And I want to talk about those and share those with you. So one of the articles I found has got its roots back in 1973. So it was a Dr. Bernard Beitman Now, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that name correctly. He found himself in his kitchen at the sink in San Francisco, choking uncontrollably. He wasn't eating or drinking, so there was nothing to cough up, but for several minutes he couldn't catch his breath or swallow. So, went to bed, and that's that. But the next day, his brother called him to tell him that 3,000 miles away in Wilmington, Delaware, that their father had died. He had bled into his throat, choking on his own blood at the same time as Dr. Beitman's coughing fit in his own house in San Francisco. So, of course, with all the emotion that this gave him, Beitman became fascinated with what he calls meaningful coincidences. After becoming a professor of psychiatry at the University of Missouri, he published several papers and 2 books on the subject and started a non-profit organization called the Coincidence Project to encourage people to share their stories. Now, I'm quoting him here when he says, "What I look for as a scientist and a spiritual seeker are the patterns that lead to meaningful coincidences. So many people are reporting this kind of experience. Understanding how it happens is part of the fun." So, other researchers who study coincidences are divided over their significance. Some, like Beitman, believe that they suggest a deeper connection between our minds and the material world than modern science can explain. Others see coincidences as pure mathematical probabilities, just like the classic theorem that people throw up, where you could have a number of monkeys in a room on a typewriter typing randomly, and at some point they will produce the works of Shakespeare. Unlikely, but not inexplicable or totally improbable. So Beitman defines a coincidence as 2 events coming together with apparently no causal explanation. They can be life-changing, like his experience with his father, or comforting, such as when a loved one's favourite song comes on the radio just when you're missing them the most. What's key, however, though, is that there must be an element of surprise to the events, and this is definitely the view that Mark Johansson, a psychology professor at Cardiff University in Wales, believes. When you experience a coincidence, you are surprised because there was an event that conflicts with your causal model of how the world works, he said. There's a mismatch there. Now, that's absolutely true with the example I said of my dad meeting his cousin, because you just wouldn't expect that, like I said, at a random invite to have a dinner. At this point, I'm also going to throw out another story of mine. And again, this is the surprise element, and to follow on with the view of Mark Johansson about there being a conflict with how your mind works. So years ago, and I'm going even further back now, so we're probably talking, I wouldn't even want to suggest, but maybe say 15 years ago, I was on a holiday with my wife, she was my partner at the time, my wife. We went to Ecuador and the Galapagos, and on that trip, there was a guy from South Africa called Malcolm who we befriended, a really nice guy, and we said our goodbyes. And then, I don't know, a year, maybe 18 months later, no more than that, me and my wife, we went to a holiday to Argentina. And on the last morning, we were waiting to go to the airport, so we were having breakfast at our hotel the final morning. Just as we finished breakfast, I stand up to leave the table, and I hear someone shout our names. And I'm thinking, I'm in Buenos Aires, I don't know anybody here. And I turned around, and it was Malcolm from the previous trip that we went on to Ecuador. And he had booked the same holiday that we were doing, but his had started the day we were leaving. So he'd got there the night before while we were leaving that morning. And again, yes, you can explain it by saying we met on an adventure type holiday, and we then booked on a similar one, and he's booked on a similar one. But again, it's the fact that we booked at the same time, just meeting at that moment. So if we'd have had breakfast earlier, we wouldn't have seen him. If we'd have had breakfast slightly later, we wouldn't have seen him. If we decided to go to the airport earlier, we wouldn't have seen him. If he decided to have breakfast earlier or later. So again, it's in my mind, these things just constantly fascinate me because it's like almost it shouldn't happen, but it does. But I'm going to now go back to the psychology behind it. And we're going to go back to the chap I mentioned before in my last story, Mark Johansson at Cardiff University. Now, he started by developing the Weird Coincidence Survey in 2006 to assess what types of coincidences are most commonly observed and what personality types are more correlated with noticing them and how most people explain them. So at the time this article I found was written, there were around 3,000 people that had completed the survey so far. Beitman himself is still collecting data, but he has drawn a few conclusions. The most commonly reported coincidences are associated with mass media. A person thinks of an idea, then hears or sees it on the TV, the radio, or the internet. Thinking of someone and then having that person call unexpectedly is next on the list, followed by being in the right place at the right time to advance one's work, career, or education. And again, this is really interesting. So if you think about what I've said a number of times already about reading a book, thinking of something, talk to someone, and the same thing appears on the radio or TV. So when I was formulating this episode and putting the notes together, I was actually also that day editing an episode of Casting Views featuring Josh from Talking Smack. It was the recent Mindwipe episode from last month. I honestly would recommend you go listen to it if you haven't. He shares some brilliant stories. But whilst I was editing that episode, I was talking to him and a number of other people, another number of other podcasters in a WhatsApp group I'm in. And we were discussing in the WhatsApp chat the Deadpool and Wolverine soundtrack. And Josh started discussing Green Day in the WhatsApp chat. And whilst I was editing, Josh in the episode was discussing Green Day. So literally the bit I got to with Josh talk about Green Day, he then brings it up in the WhatsApp chat. And again, I think that just sums up what Beitman was saying as that third most common factor happening, or most, the thing that people think of most. And again, it's just that for me, just mentioning Green Day in a WhatsApp chat is one thing. Me getting to that episode, I could have edited that episode earlier, later. We might not have even had that conversation. I think, like I said, we were talking about the Deadpool and Wolverine soundtrack because I just bought it. Anyway, you can see what I'm saying. And these are the things that continually keep my mind occupied. So back to Beitman's findings. People who describe themselves as spiritual or religious report noticing more meaningful coincidences than those who do not. And people are more likely to experience coincidences when they are in a heightened emotional state, perhaps under stress or grieving. And again, that's probably natural. If you're grieving, you're probably, that sense of loss is so great. You're probably trying or wanting to have that connection to the loved one you've lost in things that are happening around you. The most popular explanation among survey respondents for mysterious coincidences was God or fate. The second explanation, pure randomness. And the third is that our minds are connected to one another. And the fourth is that our minds are connected to the environment. All things that possibly you've heard people talking about. He is also particularly interested in what he's dubbed simulpathity, feeling a loved one's pain at a distance as he believes he did with his father. Science can't currently explain how it might occur, but his books offer some non-traditional ideas, such as the existence of the psychosphere, which he puts as a kind of mental atmosphere at which information and energy can travel between two people who are emotionally close but physically distant. Just think of it as almost like a connected web, to put it a different way, I guess. In his book, Meaningful Coincidences, How and Why Synchronicity and Serendipity Happen, he states the story of a young man who intended to end his life by an isolated lake. While he sat crying in his car, another car pulled up and this guy's brother got out. When the young man asked for an explanation, the brother said he didn't know why he got in the car, where he was going, or what he would do when he got there. He just knew he needed to get into the car and drive. Now, Beitman says, I don't sound right, but I'm telling you, this stuff happens. Scientists have difficulty believing it because they don't know how it happens. David Hand, a British statistician and author of a 2014 book, The Improbability Principle, Why Coincidences, Miracles and Rare Events Happen Every Day, he's at the opposite end of the spectrum from Beitman. He says most coincidences are fairly easy to explain, and he specialises in demystifying even the strangest ones. So quoting David Hand, he says, when you look closely at a coincidence, you can often discover the chance of it happening is not as small as you think. It's perhaps not a 1 in a billion chance, but in fact a 1 in 100 chance, and yet you would expect that would happen quite often. David then says, take winning the lottery twice. If you have a 1 in 100 million chance of winning the lottery once, then the chance of winning twice is 1 in 100 million squared, a seemingly impossible event. But if you take the number of people who play the lottery and the number of times they buy tickets, then it becomes almost certain that someone somewhere will win twice. And in fact, a number of people have done that, and I'm going to talk about one of those people later. So Hand calls this the law of truly large numbers. He says you take something that has a very small chance of happening, you give it lots and lots of opportunities to happen, then the overall probability becomes bigger. Asked how he took Beitman's experience with choking at the same time as his father was dying, Hand questioned whether another person, less sensitive to coincidences, would have noticed a coincidence at all. Such a person might simply have assumed they had a dry throat. Would Beitman have been just as amazed if he choked at the same time as a sibling lay dying, or a friend or professor or a neighbour? Each additional person on the list makes a probability of one of those events happening more likely, he says. But just because Hand has a mathematical view doesn't mean he finds coincidences boring. He says it's just like looking at a rainbow. Just because I understand the physics behind it doesn't make it any less wonderful. So I'm going to go back to Mark Johansson, the psychology professor at Cardiff. He and his colleague Magda Osman, a professor of basic and applied decision making at the University of Cambridge, they are particularly interested in how we determine whether a coincidence is a chance event or not. Paying attention to coincidences, they say, is an essential part of how humans make sense of the world. We rely constantly on our understanding of cause and effect to survive. Quoting Osman, coincidences are often associated with something mystical or supernatural, but if you look under the hood, noticing coincidences is what humans do all the time. Charles Zeltzer, a clinical psychologist and Jungian analyst in Santa Barbara, offers another perspective. Zeltzer spent 50 years studying the writings of Carl Jung, the Swiss psychologist who introduced the modern Western world to the idea of synchronicity. Jung defined synchronicity as the coincidence in time of two or more causally unrelated events which have the same meaning. Now, one of Jung's most iconic synchronistic stories concerned a patient who he felt had become so stuck in her own rationality that it interfered with her ability to understand her own psychology and emotional life. One day, the patient was recounting a dream in which she'd received a golden scarab. Just then, Jung heard a gentle tapping at the window. He opened the window and a scarab-like beetle flew into the room. Jung plucked the insect out of the air, presented it to his patient, and goes, "Here it is, here's your scarab." The experience proved therapeutic because it demonstrated to Jung's patient that the world is not always rational, leading her to break her own identification with rationality and become more open to her emotional life. Like Jung, Zeltzer believes meaningful coincidences can encourage people to acknowledge the irrational and mysterious. He says we have a fantasy that there is always an answer and that we should know everything. Studies suggest most people notice about one coincidence a week. So, having said right at the start that there are things that happen to us all the time, studies actually suggest that most people notice about one coincidence a week, and most of us have at least one favourite to share. I've shared mine right at the top of this, but the author of the article I was taking also had one to share now, and apologies I don't have the author to hand here, but they said I'd been on the fence about writing about coincidences when I arranged to meet a friend at a cafe about 20 minutes from my house. When I arrived, I was surprised to see the foreign editor of the Times, Coincidence One. I hadn't seen him since the beginning of the pandemic, and he invited me to join him until my friend arrived. I mentioned that the friend I was meeting works as a foreign correspondent for another newspaper. It turned out he was possibly looking to hire someone in the same city where my friend is living. Coincidence 2. When my friend arrived, she said she was looking for a new job. Coincidence 3. And at this point, I pulled Beitman's new book out of my bag. Coincidence 4. I'd grabbed it just before leaving home in case my friend was late and I needed something to read. Later, as I drove home, I thought, how can I not write about coincidences after this coincidental cascade? And actually, that's a term I love, and I think I want to going to use that, a coincidental cascade. So that really is a little bit around the digging in and some of the psychologists' explanations or views of coincidences. So I'm about to go into some examples I found of coincidences. I just wanted to share one final one from me, a personal one. And this was, again, a number of years ago. There was an event here in the UK, in London. It was an experience with, an evening with type affair. It was Sylvester Stallone, and being a huge Sylvester Stallone fan growing up, I really wanted to go to it. So me and my wife got tickets, and it's in a big venue. There was a meal first, and then Stallone would come out, be interviewed for an hour, and there'd be Q&A from the audience. Now, we got there early, we sat down, and my wife then asked me, I think I needed to drop some of our coats at I can't remember now what you call them, but where you leave your coats to pick up at the end of the day. And it was a really long queue, and there was another really long queue next to me going the opposite way for the bar. And I'm sitting there and I'm looking around, and it's taking ages. And then all of a sudden, as my queue's moving and the queue next to me's moving, we stop, and I look to my right, to the person in the other queue. He looks back at me, and it was my cousin. It was my cousin's husband. We didn't know we were going to the same event. And if we hadn't have met there, we wouldn't have seen each other because they were at a table at the other end of the venue. But we just happened to be queuing for different things, and we sort of going different ways, but we stopped at exactly the same point in time, which made us recognize each other. So I find that fascinating. Now we were at an event that we didn't know, but that's fine because, again, it's a big event. So likelihood of people who know each other going to an event like that is going to be high, right? But the fact for me that makes it the funny coincidence is being in a queue, two different queues, and meeting at exactly the same point, queuing for those things at the same time as well. If I then move on to some of the ones I found around the internet. So I've got one here called the lightning magnet. Now, there's a saying that lightning never strikes in the same place twice. Well, this story says, tell that to Walter Summerford, a British officer who was struck by lightning 4 times throughout his life, 3 while he was alive and once after he had passed away. Summerford was a major in the British Army during World War I and was first struck by lightning on a battlefield in Belgium in 1918. The strike paralysed him from the waist down. After retiring to Vancouver, Summerford slowly rehabilitated and regained the ability to walk. However, 6 years later, he was struck by lightning again while fishing, which paralysed the right side of his body. Despite the odds, Summerford survived both strikes and continued to live his life, but then he was struck by lightning a 3rd time in 1930 while walking in a park in Vancouver. This strike left him paralysed and bedridden until his passing 2 years later. The 4th time, well, that was his gravestone. That was struck by lightning too. Some people have called him the unluckiest man in the world, but the story of Walter Summerford is a remarkable example of the power of nature and the resilience of the human spirit. Now, this next story is titled Twin Strangers Living the Same Life. James Allen Lewis and James Allen Springer were identical twins who were separated at birth and adopted by different families. They were reunited at the age of 39 in 1979, but here's the strange part. They led almost identical lives despite growing up in different households. The twins were born in 1940 and were both adopted in Ohio by families who named them James. Both boys went by the nickname Jim, and they grew up just 45 miles apart in Ohio and Minnesota. Jim Lewis was aware that he had a twin brother, but Jim Springer's mother had told him that his twin had died at birth. But the similarities didn't stop there. The Jims each married and divorced women named Linda, and both remarried women named Betty. Both worked in law enforcement and had similar drinking and smoking habits. They had identical childhood pets named Toy, and both named their firstborn sons James Allen. The twin story gained national attention and was featured in news reports and on television shows. The twins participated in studies on separated twins, which aimed to understand the role of genetics and environment in shaping human behaviour and development. So, yeah, again, what a fascinating story there, that there are 2 twins who you'd assume to lead fairly similar lives if they were together, but being split up at birth, but having remarkably similar stories, marrying women with the same name, remarrying women with the same name, same job or the same career. Fascinating. So we're going to jump now to a different type of coincidence here. So this is regarding a couple. So in the early 2000s, soon to be married couple Alex and Donna were looking through old photos to put in their wedding video. While looking through these photos, they found one of Donna and her siblings posing with Peter Pan Smee on a childhood trip to Disney World in 1980. But there was something that shocked them in the background of the photo, or someone to be precise. It was her husband Alex being pushed in a stroller by his father. Until that moment, the couple had no idea that they'd been at Disney World at the same time as kids long before they knew each other, let alone in the same photo. In 2010, they returned to Disney World to recreate the photo with their own children. So again, if we look at numbers, the chance of two random people being at Disney World at the same time and then meeting each other possibly has got to be high-ish. I'm no statistician. But the fact then that two marry each other and they're in the same photo. So remember, a photo is literally just a snapshot of time. So the fact that Alex appeared in that snapshot, that's the thing that's ultimately so fascinating to me. And remember earlier when I was talking about David Hand, the British statistician who was talking about the lottery wins, I've got a couple of stories here that focus on that. So again, I know I've mentioned this story before, but again, this story just lives in my head all the time. It's just one of those fascinating things. Now, we're going to Australia for this. It's about a trucker called Bill Morgan. Now, he was dubbed the luckiest bloke in the world after he came back from the dead and won the lottery twice, one time being on live TV. Bill was declared clinically dead by doctors after a horror car crash left him in a coma after suffering a heart attack in 1998. However, the then 37-year-old miraculously woke up 2 weeks later, astounding medics and beating the odds. Feeling like his return from the dead was something of a stroke of luck, Bill decided to make the most of it and bought himself a scratch card. Sure enough, the lottery scratcher won him a car worth £17,000. Now, the story of Bill coming back from the dead, coming out of the coma, and the lotto win caught the attention of the local press, and a TV news outlet asked Bill to reenact the win for the cameras. And this is on YouTube. I'm going to try link it. I know I say that, but I will try to link it. So this is out there to see. So they filmed Bill. He walks into a shop, proceeds to buy a scratch card and scratch it off right there in front of the cameras, just like he had before. But to his astonishment, and you see it, he just speechless for a second. He holds up the ticket and he goes, "I've just won $250,000. I'm not joking." The win, which was worth around £140,000, knocked Bill for six, and the news footage shows him visibly reeling as he tries to comprehend what's just happened to him. He says, laughing, "I think I'm going to have another heart attack." He can then be seen calling his fiancée to tell her the unbelievable news. The footage shot for 9 News Australia has recently re-emerged, with Bill's unlikely story going viral. Bill, who was living in a caravan at the time, immediately bought himself a house and invested the rest of the win. "Every day I get up and put on my shoes, and even if I'm not real well, I have a shuffle down the road, smell the roses, look at the sun, and think about how lucky I am," he said. "I won £250,000. The house I live in, I own. I've got a nice car. Sure, I had to retire because the heart got too much and I'm riddled with arthritis, but it was all for the best." I mean, what an outlook, eh? And just, yeah, honestly, I do ask you, go check that video out because it's incredible. And I'll finish with one final story here on the lottery, where a woman has won a $1 million prize on the lottery for the second time in 10 weeks. Massachusetts State Lottery revealed Christine Wilson was the lucky ticket holder who hit the jackpot twice. Miss Wilson of Attleboro, Massachusetts, won her most recent prize playing that 100 times cash $10 instant ticket game. Back in February, she claimed the first $1 million in the Lifetime Millions $50 instant ticket game. On both occasions, she opted to receive her prize in the form of a one-time payment of $650,000. When she won her first prize, Miss Wilson said that she planned to use some of her winnings to buy a new car, and she plans to put the latest windfall into savings. So, again, 10 weeks, she's won 2 $1 million prize jackpots. I mean, amazing. So, yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this episode. And yeah, it was a bit of indulgence for me because it's something I just can never get enough of. I just think, okay, I've not won the lottery once, let alone twice, but these small, seemingly random acts of coincidence just always fascinate me. And, before I end this episode, I would like to say, firstly, thank you for listening. But if you do have anything like this, please do share with me. If you're happy to come on, we can do another episode. You can talk about it with me on air, as it were. But yeah, do let me know via social media if there are any fascinating coincidences that you'd like to share. You can get hold of me across all platforms at Casting Views. So just look for Casting Views on your platform of choice. Or you can drop me a note at castingviewspod@gmail.com. And honestly, I really do look forward to hearing from you. So until next week, I'm Dan at Casting Views. Take care.
1, 2, 3, 4. If I want your opinion, I will give it to you. Come on, take what we've got, 'cause you need it. Don't make us get